For the RAF, it was a 75th birthday party with 10,000 guests, both young and old, at RAF Marham. One plane from every RAF squadron was on parade, polished to perfection. The Queen arrived to join the celebration, marking 3/4 of a century of the Air Force that gave the world the few. She's a regular visitor here. The airbase is only a few miles from Sandringham, and the officers and men of the base are close to the Queen's heart.
We were very honoured by her visit here during the Gulf conflict in the January of '91, and as I say, she keeps in very close touch, and people here really do appreciate that.
The Queen presented a new colour to the RAF to mark the occasion, only the 4th in its history. No birthday is complete without a cake. Today, the cake-cutting honours performed by Her Majesty. Sadly, pouring rain forced the cancellation of the biggest flypast since the coronation. The royal dais dismantled, unused.
It's 6 months practice and 6 months hard work, which in the end is not seen on the day, but we can't control the weather yet.
And this is what the Queen missed, filmed during the dress rehearsal, which did go ahead.
The Royal Air Force was born on April the 1st, 1918, when the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service were amalgamated into a single force. On the day of its conception, the RAF was occupied in a critical stage of one of the greatest wars in history. Since that day, some 75 years ago, the Royal Air Force has rarely been able to claim a non-operational period of service. The history of the RAF is essentially a record of men and machines, but the aircraft are only part of the story, for they couldn't function at all without a human being pressing the first button or flicking the first switch. From the early pioneering days of string and canvas to the present-day sophisticated concoction of computerized machinery, predominantly it is an account of men and their unconquerable spirit. Accordingly, this 75-year account is mainly one of men's deeds, courage, and foresight, and above all, of their sacrifices. It is also a story of triumph over insuperable obstacles. There is an old adage that old men make wars, young men fight them. The young men of the RAF have for over 7.5 decades served their country magnificently.
I love flying for its own sake. Flying is great sport, you know, great fun. Flying an aeroplane.
The Royal Air Force has not only remained in Britain's front line of defence and offence against any would-be aggressor, but also as an integral part of the Western powers' armoury against any threat to international freedom.
We'd all like to go back home. We all got families and friends back home. We all like to see them, but we understand the job we've got to do, and it's a job we've been trained to do, really.
During the course of the First World War, the use of aircraft as a weapon had rapidly increased, and although the British Army had originally been sceptical about the first motley squadrons of the Royal Flying Corps, doubting their effectiveness in combat, their worth very soon became apparent. By 1917, the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service had grown to such an extent, with further expansion proposed, that problems started to develop in organization. Both the War Office and the Admiralty believed that they, respectively, should have paramount influence in air matters. The Prime Minister, Lloyd George, decided differently and invited an impartial assessment of the situation from an outsider. His choice was the eminent South African soldier, Lieutenant General Jan Smuts. In his report in August 1917, Smuts recommended the setting up of an independent organization with a separate air ministry and a separate air staff. This report was approved by the War Ministry, and a bill was quickly drafted and passed through Parliament. On April the 1st, 1918, with Major General Sir Hugh Trenchard appointed as the first Chief of Air Staff, the Royal Air Force came into being. In the next 7 months remaining of the war, the RAF fought many battles, mainly with German fighters attacking reconnaissance aircraft and bombers. In June 1918, the Independent Bombing Force was introduced into the RAF, which continued on a course of long-range strategic bombing. Although these attacks were light by latest standards, they set a pattern which governed the RAF's thinking in the future. By July, much of the German offensive had petered out, and a few RAF squadrons were dispatched to Italy to support the armies which were fighting the Austrian forces. The Allies went over to an all-out offensive in September 1918, and with German resources exhausted and Austrian defenses crumbling, the Austrians accepted terms on the 3rd of November, and the Germans soon followed. The armistice was signed on the 11th of November. The carnage of the Great War had at last come to an end. In November 1918, the strength of the Royal Air Force amounted to about 27,500 officers and 264,000 other ranks, including 25,000 women. The squadrons amounted to over 22,500 aircraft, including some 3,300 which were still in the front line, and over 100 airships. This enormous force, necessary in war, could inevitably not be supported in peacetime, and in the wake of post-war depression, most of the squadrons were quickly wound down and disbanded. Men and women were demobilized, and even the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Hugh Trenchard, lost his job. Thousands of aircraft were scrapped or, where possible, sold off for conversion to civil roles. The Independent Bombing Force was disbanded. Outstanding contracts with manufacturers were cancelled, and many companies in the aircraft industries faced closure or liquidation. The streamlined force that now remained was split into 3 separate groups: the northern area, the southern area, and the coastal area. The whole future of the RAF as Britain's third military force was now shadowed by doubt. There was danger that it was to be broken up completely and its squadrons handed over to the Army and the Navy. It was Winston Churchill, a man who publicly showed distaste for air warfare and the bombing of innocent civilians, who was largely responsible for the RAF's salvation. When he was appointed Secretary of State for War and Air in January 1919, he showed his irrefutable quality of far-sightedness in inviting Sir Hugh Trenchard back to retain his old post as Chief of the Air Staff. Trenchard was a single-minded commander, highly determined and with a strong sense of purpose. He soon put into operation a plan to put the structure of the RAF onto a permanent basis. In early 1920, he opened the RAF College at Cranwell, where suitable cadets underwent highly professional training before qualifying as officers. 2 months later, in a measure to win public support and to improve morale, he established the Central Band of the RAF. The band soon established a high reputation for the quality of its performances, an excellence which it has retained to this day. Trenchard, in his reinstated position, very quickly realized that public interest and support was essential if the RAF was to survive as a peacetime force. In one of his remarkably astute exercises in public relations, he opened the very first RAF air show at Hendon on the 3rd of July 1920. This show could not have been timed better, for the public had started to become increasingly aware of aviation. Alcock and Brown had recently made their crossing of the Atlantic in a modified Vickers Vimy, and the RAF had followed by making the same journey in an airship and back again. Following which, a four-man team had flown in a converted Vickers Vimy all the way from England to Australia. The public flocked to the Hendon Air Show in their thousands and were duly captivated by the skills of the RAF pilots, giving displays of aerobatics, mock bombing, and close formation flying. Public support for the RAF was now established, and the Hendon pageant became an annual event with ever-increasing crowds turning out for the displays. With the future of the RAF now becoming more certain, Trenchard set about implementing his plans for the years ahead. In the early 1920s, France was considered a potential enemy. So when, in 1922, the Times reported that the French possessed a frontline force of over 600 aircraft, there was considerable public alarm, and pressure was put on the Air Ministry to do something about the expansion of its own, now depleted, Air Force. In June 1923, the Cabinet authorized the creation of an Air Defence of Great Britain, which was to consist of 52 squadrons, although several years were to pass before this force was completed. The force was split into 4 sections. There was the fighting area and the bombing area. There were the special reserve squadrons, which were composed of a mixture of regular airmen and local volunteers. And lastly, there was the Auxiliary Air Force, consisting of squadrons which depended totally on part-time weekend flyers. Although the RAF was now in a state of expansion within its structure, financial restrictions had prevented the design and manufacture of new aircraft. Most of the RAF squadrons were equipped with little more than improved versions of the wartime wood and fabric machines. By 1934, the original plan for a force of 52 squadrons had still not been completely implemented. Only 42 had been established, with a first-line strength of 488 aircraft. Against opposition in Parliament, the government decided to embark on a further expansion program. The RAF was to increase as soon as possible to 75 squadrons, and within the next 5 years to a total of 128 squadrons. This policy was inspired largely by the belief that air bombardment alone could win a war, and that Britain should be equipped with a force capable of getting in the first major attacks. The RAF until this period had mainly been equipped with biplanes, military thinking being that they were safer than the monoplanes which were being developed by the civilian airliner builders and for private use. However, under the command of Ellington, the situation had started to change, and the RAF began to introduce a new family of aircraft into its ranks. The squadrons were taking delivery of faster, heavier and more efficient aircraft. These included the Wellington, Anson, Wellesley, Whitley, Hampden, Lysander, Blenheim and the Sunderland flying boat. With these rapid expansion plans being put into operation and the opening of new airfields all over the country, the RAF now looked as though it might once again be a force to be reckoned with by would-be aggressors. For the fighter squadrons, there was little change, but the far-seeing Sir Edward Ellington had decided that the Gloucester Gauntlet and Gladiator biplanes needed replacement. Ellington, as did many other senior officers at the time, felt more than uneasy about the changing situation in Europe. Hitler had taken power in Germany and, contrary to the Treaty of Versailles, had formed the Luftwaffe, with a pilot from the First World War, the infamous Hermann Goering, as its commander-in-chief. Ellington headed a team which issued 3 major specifications for the RAF's future aircraft, which he considered to be vital if the RAF were to have any real effect in the war which he felt was brewing. The first of these was for a fast and maneuverable fighter, which could carry a minimum of 8 machine guns compared to the biplane's 4. 2 aircraft manufacturers responded to this specification. One was Hawker, which under the engineering genius of Sidney Cam at once set about the task. The second was the Supermarine Company, with Reginald J. Mitchell as its chief designer. This development coincided with 2 other major innovations. One was the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and the other the adoption of the .303 Browning machine gun. From these 2 stables, Hawker and Vickers Supermarine, came aircraft which were to write their own chapter in the history of the RAF in years ahead. From Hawker, the Hurricane, which entered service in 1937, and from Supermarine, the legendary Spitfire, which entered service in 1938. The second of the Ellington team's future specifications was for the development of a 4-engined heavy bomber, which could carry a far heavier bomb load than any of the aircraft then in service. The third was for a medium heavy bomber, which had a mid-wing and only 2 engines. But unlike its predecessors, which were built of wooden canvas, this new design was to be all metal. Another enormously important development also took place during this period, and it was one which came about almost by accident. A team of eminent scientists had been working on a directive to find ways in which to repel enemy air attack. One of the amazing possibilities examined was the notion of a death ray which would destroy approaching aircraft. Although this idea was discarded as nonsense, they did find through their tests that approaching aircraft re-radiated radio signals. From this, the concept was born, which later became known as radar. With the ever-increasing threat of war, it was now time for this new Air Force to implement new structural alterations within its own administration. In the United Kingdom, this meant dividing the RAF into separate commands according to function. A training command was established, whilst the operational groups were split into bomber, fighter and coastal commands. Overseas, there were 5 more: the Middle East, the Mediterranean, India, Aden, and the Far East. All of these commands were responsible to the Chief of the Air Staff via the Air Council. Each command controlled regional groups which administered their own stations, which in turn administered the squadrons. And this was the structure of the Royal Air Force, which was to fight the Second World War. In September 1939, the strength of the Royal Air Force amounted to 1,476 aircraft in Britain and a further 435 stationed overseas. The total strength of the manpower amounted to 118,000 regulars and 60,000 reservists. Compared with the Luftwaffe's 3,600 aircraft and more than 500,000 serving personnel, the prospects ahead for the RAF were daunting, to say the least. At the outbreak of war, Bomber Command, under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Sir Ludlow Hewitt, mustered only 33 squadrons, the aircraft consisting of Wellingtons, Whitleys, Hampdens, Blenheims and Fairey Battles. 10 of these squadrons were dispatched to France as part of the Advanced Air Striking Force. In Britain, the remaining squadrons were not yet considered capable of delivering an effective bombing offensive against Germany, so they were given 2 other directives by the War Cabinet. The only military attacks were to be against enemy warships at sea, and over land, orders were given to confine all flights to leaflet dropping over the German people. The leaflets told the German people the truth, that this war would cost them the loss of thousands of lives and the destruction of their country, and could only end in disaster. But the effects of this propaganda were negligible. The attacks by Bomber Command against enemy warships began the day after war was declared, with a daylight strike by 10 Blenheims against the German pocket battleship Admiral von Scheer and the cruiser Emden. It was an extremely gallant attack, but unfortunately fruitless, and 5 of the Blenheims were lost. At this time, the RAF believed that if squadrons of bombers flew in close formation on daylight raids on warships, the aircraft's front and rear machine gun turrets would render them almost invulnerable. The result was the opposite. Enemy fighters were picking them off at an alarming rate. On average, 10 RAF bombers were lost for every 4 German fighters shot down. Bomber Command quickly came to recognize the need for long-distance fighter escorts if the bombers were to continue daylight raids, but these, as yet, were not available. Coastal Command entered the war with 3 groups: the west and east of England and Scotland, all under the command of Air Chief Marshal Sir Frederick Bowhill. The command's collection of aircraft consisted of Ansons, Lockheed Hudsons from America, the ancient Wildebeest torpedo bombers, Sunderlands, Londons and Stranraers. Their main duties were reconnaissance over the North Sea and escorting shipping in the Atlantic approaches. Their main enemy was the German U-boat. Although Coastal Command received lower priority than the other 2 operational commands, it carried out its work with great efficiency. The third of the RAF's operational commands came under the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. For the first few months of the war, Fighter Command was concentrating on building up the strength of its squadrons. It was estimated that Britain would need 53 squadrons for the defence of the country, but they only started the war with 35. These were equipped with Hurricane Spitfires and Gloucester Gladiators. To meet the demand for new aircrew, the Empire Air Training Scheme was formed with the support of Canada, Rhodesia and South Africa, and recruits poured in from friendly countries around the world. During the Second World War, not only did the RAF make an outstanding contribution to the victory, it also made remarkable progress in the development of aircraft and avionic technology. The early twin-engined heavy bombers were replaced with the mighty four-engined machines, the Stirling, the Halifax, and the magnificent Lancaster. The Mosquito made its debut and proved to be an invaluable asset to the RAF in its multi-role capability. It wasn't only British aircraft that the RAF were using. Under the Lend-Lease agreement, the United States supplied a whole variety of aircraft, including the Thunderbolt, Kitty Hawk, Avenger, Aerocobra, and the formidable Mustang. Bomber Command took delivery of the American Mitchell, Marauder, Boston, and the immortal Fortress and Liberator, whilst Coastal Command had the Catalina and the Hudson, and Transport Command acquired the great workhorse of World War II, the DC-3 Dakota. To give a full account of the Royal Air Force during the Second World War would require volumes of films such as this, and to try to condense the magnitude of achievements into a few minutes would not do justice to the outstanding chapters that were written in the annals of RAF history. Perhaps more importantly, we would not be doing justice to the many tens of thousands of men and women who gave their lives in writing those chapters. After the Second World War, the RAF had emerged as perhaps the premier air force of the world, possibly not in size, although it had reached colossal numbers, but as an air force which had, against overwhelming odds, surpassed itself in the eyes of the world in every theatre of war. But the post-war period was soon to prove that a different type of air force was needed, and that the rules of air warfare were going to be rewritten many times in the years ahead. The enormous size of the Royal Air Force with which Britain had ended World War II was going to be impractical for the years of peace, which everybody hoped would stretch ahead. Many squadrons were therefore disbanded. Thousands of aircraft were scrapped, and the serving personnel were sent back to Civvy Street. For since the use of the atomic bomb over Japan, conventional forms of air defense became meaningless, and if there was ever going to be another war, the use of atomic bombs could mean the annihilation of an entire nation. In October 1947, the government announced that Britain would fund its own atomic research, and furthermore that it would be the responsibility of the RAF to carry the proposed weapons. In the same year, the Air Staff introduced Plan E, which proposed 51 fighter squadrons, 41 bomber squadrons, 13 maritime squadrons, and 42 transport squadrons, totaling approximately 1,500 aircraft. But these new directives needed new aircraft and newly trained men, because most of the experienced wartime pilots had disappeared back into civilian life. The RAF had only 2 jet-engined aircraft in service at that time, the Meteor and the Vampire, neither of which was capable of carrying large bombs. There was an urgent need for a new strategic jet bomber in Bomber Command. The Canberra, the world's first operational jet bomber, entered service in 1951, but again, although this aircraft had exceptional characteristics, it was unable to carry a nuclear payload. The RAF was awaiting the arrival of the V bombers, and the first of these was the Vickers Valiant. 10 airfields were enlarged to take these mighty new aircraft, and other stations had to construct dispersal systems to give the bombers protection against a first strike. The second of the V bombers to enter service was the awesome Vulcan, closely followed by the completion of the trio with the Victor. By the end of 1959, the V-bombers were in a constant state of readiness. With the aid of newly equipped early warning stations, they could be airborne and on their way to the target within 4 minutes.
No, taking out forward. No, fuel release forward, so I've got some fuel. Hold on a second about me.
The Vulcan crews were also later trained in low-level attacks, climbing up at the last minute to launch their weapons. This tactic was used as a countermeasure against enemy radar and ground-to-air defense missiles, which the Russians had been developing with a great deal of success. In 1963, there was a change in government policy following the development of the nuclear Polaris missiles, which could be launched from submarines. The nuclear strike capability was now to be shared with the Royal Navy. This meant the winding down of Bomber Command's nuclear force. Fighter Command also suffered at the end of World War II and was quickly wound down. By 1947, there were only 200 aircraft in the command, mainly Meteors, Vampires, Hornets and Mosquitoes. Again, as with Bomber Command, when the threat of the Cold War emerged, an expansion plan was put into operation, and by 1952, the number of aircraft had doubled. However, the jets of the RAF would have been no match for the Russian MiGs, so as a stopgap until more sophisticated aircraft could be produced, the RAF introduced the American Sabre jet. Two years later, in 1954, the new jets started to enter service. The first of these was the Swift, and then followed the Hunter. The Hunter proved to be the most successful and became the standard RAF single-seater fighter until the 1960s. By the end of the decade, the strength of Fighter Command was up to 600 aircraft, including the introduction of the RAF's first supersonic fighter, the Lightning, which was capable of achieving twice the speed of sound. But this was a period of rapid development in air warfare. Technology on all sides was changing fast. By the time the RAF had built up the strength of its fighter force, the Russians had pioneered and perfected the surface-to-surface intercontinental missile. In the early part of the 1960s, the intrusion of Russian reconnaissance aircraft into British airspace was causing concern. In an effort to step up the early warning systems, the Shackleton was employed, flying long sorties, 8 hours and more over the North Sea and other strategic waters, watching out with sophisticated detection equipment for potential Russian intruders. In April of 1968, Fighter Command was amalgamated with Bomber Command to form the RAF's new Strike Command. This same year also saw the introduction of a new fighter, the American Phantom. In addition to its home commitments, the RAF was continuing throughout this period to remain as a potent force in West Germany as part of NATO. The introduction of helicopters meant the start of a complete new phase of search and rescue operations. For now, the RAF was also responsible for the rescue of civilians, and this was to become a highly regarded activity. By the end of the 1960s, there was a new replacement for the Shackleton, derived from the Comet airliner, the Nimrod.
Okay, time trackers.
Acoustics.
Turning. Okay, range of DRP now.
Selected. 04, Difar, 31. Red RAS, that's what the contact is.
Okay, submarine on the surface, it's 230 at about 6 knots. We'll give you an ident. Pilot are tracking.
Roger.
Do you want cameras? Affirmative, 12-inch lens, port side.
Stand by. Do you want any low-fi in the water?
Wait. See what it is first.
Roger.
Now, MAD is running. 6 calls for the MAD captain. Camera team ready. Won't be on imaging. Air brakes. 2 miles to run, camera. We'll mark it with a buoy, okay? Okay, it's Tango. Impression that it's a Foxtrot. Okay, it's coming up to you. Drop the buoy. Now, camera, now.
9-6 has gone. 5 shots taken. 5.6. 3 shots. 5 value 18.
In the last years of World War II, Transport Command experienced a massive increase, growing to over 1,200 aircraft. Unlike the others, their role had not ended at the finish of the war, and they were now concentrating on the Berlin airlift. The Dakotas, which had formed the majority of the aircraft within the squadrons, were all due to go back to the USA under the Lend-Lease arrangement. But the RAF decided to keep a proportion of the aircraft by buying them outright or extending the leases. They also had many converted heavy bombers, far from ideal for Transport Command commitments. After the Berlin airlift, much of Transport Command's duties in Germany were taken over by the newly formed civilian BEA, although the DC-3s continued to carry freight and passengers to the occupying forces. By the early 1950s, the command had been drastically reduced to only 50 aircraft. This was soon to change, however, after the outbreak of war in Korea in 1950 and the political unrest in the Middle East. They were needed for the transportation of troops and supplies to these far-off theaters. It was also becoming necessary for Transport Command to take on the role of carrying small mobile strike forces at high speed to distant trouble spots in the Commonwealth. This resulted in the production of a modern fleet of strategic and tactical aircraft. In August 1967, Transport Command was renamed Air Support Command. Another new aircraft was introduced, again American, the C-130 Hercules. It wasn't only the production of aircraft that was decreased after World War II. For the less aircraft that were necessary, the less need for aircrew and support staff, and therefore the less need for training. But although it was necessary to train less personnel, the purpose of that training was to introduce a new breed of men for a new type of aircraft, the fast jets. The wartime primary trainers were originally the Tiger Moth and Magister, and for twin training, the Anson and Oxford. And for primary training, the RAF used the Chipmunk. The Varsity replaced the Ansons and Oxfords. Then came the Jet Provost, and for navigational training, the Dominie. Most of the aircraft in service with the RAF at the time had two-seat trainer variants. For the maintenance units, the end of World War II meant an increase in work. They were presented with the formidable task of salvaging and disposing of surplus aircraft and immense stocks of equipment. With the introduction of the new jet aircraft, it became increasingly necessary for the advanced aircraft to be returned to manufacturers for maintenance and repairs. This led to the introduction of new specialist units of working parties from civilian contractors working on the stations, and a close relationship built up between the manufacturers and the Royal Air Force. The maintenance units of the RAF were also trained to continue the role of repair and modification. They were also responsible for the storage of spares and reserves. The 1970s brought about a whole new set of directives for the Royal Air Force. The jet age was now advancing at an incredible rate, and so was the speed of aircraft and their capabilities. The new Air Support Command was taken over by Strike Command to augment its more aggressive element. Strike Command itself was now taking delivery of a completely new realm of aircraft. Probably the most outstanding of these was the vertical takeoff Harrier. The Phantom, the Buccaneer and the Jaguar joined Strike Command, and the Gnat was introduced as a trainer, followed by the Hawk. The Sea King helicopter was introduced along with the Lynx, Chinook and Puma. And the Tucano became the RAF's first turboprop trainer. When Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in April 1982, the commitment of the RAF was mainly in Europe as part of NATO. The decision to send a South Atlantic task force presented enormous problems, not least the fact that the islands are more than 8,000 miles from Britain. The RAF's Chief of Staff at the time was Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Beetham. When the task force left Portsmouth on the 5th of April, the RAF's contribution to the effort was clearly to be in the role of air support. Using the US Air Base of Wide Awake on the Ascension Islands as a halfway staging post, the RAF created an air bridge to the Falkland Islands. A force was deployed consisting of Vulcans, Nimrods, Hercules, VC-10s, Victors, Harriers, Phantoms and Chinook helicopters. The RAF's operations had begun on the 3rd of April when 8 Hercules aircraft landed on the Ascensions carrying troops, helicopters and equipment. These were followed by streams of other aircraft, refueled en route by the Victor K-2 tankers. There were so many that Wide Awake Base was soon dealing with 400 flights a day compared to its normal 40 per month. On the evening of the 30th of April, 2 Vulcans left the Ascensions for an attack on the Falklands airfield at Port Stanley. Next day, after refueling en route, one of the Vulcans made its attack, the other having turned back because of technical trouble. The main runway was hit, leaving it unserviceable and thus making it impossible for the Argentine Air Force to land any of its fast jets. Whilst the RAF had performed perhaps a lesser role in the combat than the Army and Navy, they had contributed to the effort magnificently and had played a vital part in securing the islands. Despite the loss of aircraft, no single RAF pilot lost his life. In the last 10 years, the Royal Air Force has continued to develop, by equipping itself with some of the most advanced and costly technology yet devised for purposes of defense or waging war. The Sentry has taken over the role as the new early warning and control aircraft after a long period of decision-making which finally resulted in the scrapping of the Nimrod AEW. There was a new aircraft for long-range transport and refueling, the TriStar. The Harrier GR5 came into service, as did the Tornado. The Tornado undoubtedly proved itself as a world-class fighting aeroplane in the Gulf War. The RAF deployed a force of Tornadoes and Jaguars to the conflict, and both distinguished themselves in an action in which air power proved once again its awesome capability. From its conception in 1918 until 7.5 decades later, the RAF has accumulated a tremendous record of achievements and triumphs. All of them, in one way or another, have been attributable to the deeds of individuals. There have been many RAF heroes, men and women, who have taken their responsibility and position far above and beyond the call of duty. Hero is a word used to signify courageous deeds. But war has a way of creating heroes, and throughout its history, in peace and war, the Royal Air Force has included countless heroes in its ranks, some recognized, many unacknowledged. For there will always be those who, for one reason or another, answer the call of duty with deeds that show no regard for their own personal safety, but only the well-being and freedom of mankind. Douglas Bader, the man who became a legend, having lost both his legs in a pre-war flying accident, he went on to become one of Britain's foremost fighter leaders. Leonard Cheshire, a wartime hero, awarded the VC for the sum total of his collective efforts. Guy Gibson VC, the man who fearlessly led the outstanding attack by the Dam Busters. Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, who led Bomber Command through its most difficult period of the Second World War.
Who say that bombing can never win a war? Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see.
All of these men, along with the thousands of their colleagues, formed the backbone of the RAF as we know it today. They passed on that spirit which still manifests itself in the Royal Air Force of the 90s, as exemplified in the Gulf War. Lord Trenchard realized 75 years ago that the RAF needed public support and approval if it was to survive. How right he was. Since the first air display at Hendon, the Royal Air Force has proudly displayed its equipment and its skills in air shows all over the world. The Royal Air Force's Battle of Britain Memorial Flight regularly displays their immaculate Lancaster, Spitfire and Hurricane. The RAF Falcons are one of the finest parachute display teams in the world. The Harrier, the world's first and only successful operational jump jet, is the star attraction of countless displays. But perhaps the most successful of the display teams, the Red Arrows. As we end this tribute with a remarkable show of the team's skills, it is plain that the RAF in 1993 has upheld its standards of excellence. And no matter what the twists and turns of world politics may bring, the Royal Air Force is ready to serve Britain, NATO, and the world in a manner that is second to none for the foreseeable future.